baby boomers.
I used to be with it.
Millennials.
Okay, boomer.
Generation X.
What's going on?
And Gen Z. What do they have in common? Not a lot, it turns out. But one thing they can agree on is that this is the political podcast they want to listen to. Welcome to Not My Generation, the political podcast that looks at political events, news, and happenings across the world and at home through a generational lens. Your hosts are Dr. Emily Stacy and Professor James Davenport, two political scientists from Rose State College. But the views expressed on this program are solely the views of the host and their guests and do not reflect the views of Rose State College, its administration, faculty, or students. Coming up on today's program, today I'm talking in like slow motion.
Shout out to Theda Scocpol for not giving me, the restraining order.
What was the context of this remark? How did it come up?
And that, listeners, was James Davenport's rant of the day.
And now, here are James and Emily. Hello, Emily.
Hi.
How are you?
I'm fantastic. We are getting to the end of the year.
Yes.
There are lights everywhere. It is very, I don't know. I'm a December baby, so it's just my time of year. I don't like the heat, and I very much dislike how we don't have a fall anymore. And so it goes from 80 to like 30. So yeah, I'm very happy now wallowing in the rain and the darkness. So we're good.
I have a question for you.
Yeah.
Actually, I have two questions
All
for
right.
you.
I love this.
First of all, what do you ever listen to our podcast after we record them, like episodes and such?
I loathe myself, so no, absolutely
okay,
not.
well, you should, because you do fantastic.
Oh, well,
Let me
thank
just
you.
say,
Appreciate
you
that.
are amazing.
Aw.
So
That's very, very kind of you.
but I listen because I listen to a ton of podcasts. And I'm always trying to say, okay, how can we improve? How can I improve?
Absolutely.
And I will tell you, if it sounds like today I'm talking in like slow motion, it's because when I listen to myself, I talk way too fast.
Do we talk like chipmunks?
No, but I talk really fast. And as a result of that, I have a lot of these pauses where you go, and sometimes it can be really distracting. So I'm trying to work on that. So if it sounds like I am slowing down, it's not because of my age. It's because I'm trying to, eliminate some of that. My sister is a speech and debate coach in Texas public schools. And you can imagine the kind of grief she gives me over that kind of stuff. And this is a shout out to Melissa Witt. She's actually going to be in town today. And she absolutely is fantastic. She's phenomenal at her job. She has developed an amazing reputation for what she does in Texas public schools with speech and debate. So shout out to her. Second question. I've been listening to a podcast. There is an economist from George Mason University, Tyler Cowen, that I follow, and he just wrote a book on who was the greatest economist of all time. And it got me thinking, who's the greatest political scientist of all time?
Oh,
Who would that be?
wow. I mean, I think it depends on what genre, right? What subfield or field of political science, right? I mean, my personal favorite is the Theda Scocpol, right? So in terms of comparative theory, and, at one point at an MPSA conference, I totally tried to fangirl her and stalked her around a hotel in Chicago. Anyway, shout out to Theda Scocpol for not giving me, the restraining order.
Yeah.
She's just everything in terms of social movement theory and kind of, the way we look at mobilization. She was a seminal part of both my master's thesis and my doctoral thesis. So,
I was thinking of two as I come in, and then their names just escaped me, but I cited both of them in my dissertation work, because they had done research specifically in the area of relationships among legislators. Exactly. You probably know this, the famous paper and book eventually on relationships between, what was the name of that? Oh, the electoral connection, right? I can't remember his name, but very famous one. And then another one came out by another political scientist roughly at the same time Congress and committees, and so it talks about these relationships. So, but it just got me thinking. I'm gonna send you the criteria he uses to identify the greatest economists, and basically he had three kind of early ones. So, and then he has three more kind of 19th, 20th century folks, and maybe we can come up with a criteria and then talk about who would put up there.
And I think that I for sure am probably more interdisciplinary maybe than and more Americanist maybe, and so people like Manuel Castells are hugely important, kind of political sociology, et cetera. So let's do that. That sounds fun.
Let's think about that. All right. Couple of news of the day that I want to get to before we get to our fantastic guest today.
I'm really excited.
We are excited to have Carmen Forman with Oklahoma Voice on with us today, and this is going to be a fun, hopefully wide-ranging conversation.
She lets me text her. I can't believe it, right? I love it.
I love the text.
Makes me happy.
Anytime you know somebody in that line, it was like, I know a celebrity, right? So yes. But just saw on the news today coming in, former Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor passed away.
Oh man, I didn't even see that.
Yes.
Lord.
First female justice on the court, appointed by Reagan, I think in 83, 84, I can't remember, but right around that time. And a very interesting political figure in and of herself. So, saw that she passed away today.
Between she and Feinstein, that's kind of a gut punch. That generation.
Those of us
women.
that grew up I grew up really in the 80s, and remember her appointment very fondly, and so just thought that was interesting. Also of note, one of the major Republican-aligned advocacy organizations, Americans for Prosperity, announced that they were endorsing Nikki Haley for president. And so this is going to be an interesting play. I know DeSantis was expecting their endorsement, and he and his campaign are none too happy. I
can't imagine why he was holding his breath. Again, we've had this conversation, right? Mm-hmm. If you are running as Diet Trump and the Kochs explicitly blackballed Trump, why would you think? I can't imagine why he was holding his breath. It's cute. They were looking for anybody else besides those two. I have been calling Nikki Haley, my students. No, in fact, whenever she left the Trump administration, man, that's a cherry position. When you get a UN ambassador, that is a cherry position. When you deuce out 2 years into that, I thought she was going to run against him, in fact, in 2020, but she held her breath and waited. This is her time. And I think, again, I've said it before on this podcast, and I'll say it again, with the abortion issue running this next election being so at the forefront, she is in a unique position as a Republican.
In the debates up to this point, she has really kind of moderated on that position and articulated a position of, look, we might be carrying this too far. Maybe we need to slow down. And it's been put back to the states. Let the states deal with it. We should be done with that, right?
Very interesting.
So it's going to be very, very interesting. I still have trouble seeing the path to taking over Trump in the primaries. The polling right now does not indicate anybody's got a great shot of doing that. Now,
I think she just now reached about 19-20%, just right. Barely.
That's correct. Now, there's a lot of time still left before primaries and people start voting. The AFP is going to bring money and volunteers to aid her campaign.
Yeah, of course they are.
So that's going to be something that's going to be helpful, extremely helpful. Yeah. So yes,
in terms of
it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out. I think. I think what Haley would like to do. I'm certain what folks who are like Koch and others who do not want Trump to be the nominee. I think what they're hoping is they can kind of deliver maybe a knockout punch to the other folks in the primaries and get a one-on-one with Trump.
I agree. Quickly.
We will see.
Right. As quickly as possible. Correct. And I think you and I kind of have pontificated that DeSantis is probably done by January. I can't imagine them going into the next debate in January, February with more than 3 of those people on stage. Right. It's the money machine is when the Kochs back you, it's on. it is on.
That's right.
Right.
That's right.
So we're going to bring Carmen into the conversation, right? Because I'm dying to.
Yes,
Well, can we preface this with we went to an event last night? Can we start there before we like get into the good stuff. So we went to an event last night hosted by our good friend Andy Moore and his colleague, Let's Fix This, and their podcast, Let's Pod This. We absolutely adore their work. They do wonderful things as talking about civic advocacy, keeping up with what's going on at the Capitol, different reforms. They're very plugged in. So shout out to them. We love them. In fact, I texted him this morning about perhaps doing a crossover episode, right? How can we, right?
That's a good idea.
Anyway,
that's a really good idea.
It's my millennialness. So anyway, they were hosting an event at Factory Obscura for their 250th episode, which I'm jealous of. We'll get there eventually, podcast listeners, right? But they featured Leslie Osborne and Senator Julia Curt. And I thought, Labor Commissioner Osborne is a very interesting figure within Oklahoma politics, particularly as a Republican woman right now, and is positioning herself as such, right? In sort of a Nikki Haley-esque type of way. In fact, she mentioned reproductive rights last night, which was interesting. Not the shock factor I'm getting. Hang on, we're getting there. She did say some very interesting things last night. And I know my colleague, James Davenport, has some things to say, but I want to get Carmen's shock factor reaction because Leslie Osborne last night in Soundbite of the Decade, for me anyway, I melted into the floor, noted that she, quote, worships brown Jesus with long hair, that face, instead of, quote, I believe it was white crew cut.
I think that's
Jesus,
like that, right?
unquote. Yeah. And I think I melted into the floor. In fact, parts of my DNA are still infused into the floor at Factory Obscura. Comments, Carmen?
What was the context of this remark? How did it come up?
She was discussing kind of the direction that Republican politics have been taking. At one point, she makes this line, which I've heard her say before, that too many people in the legislature are too concerned about saving your soul other than, delivering good government. And so it was in that vein that this kind of comment came up.
Interesting.
Yeah. So I think she is certainly positioning herself as, I am in some ways a traditional Republican. Mm-hmm. Right? I'm a Reagan Republican that wants limited government, but government that delivers on what it should be delivering on.
Right.
I don't want to be caught up in all of this culture war stuff. And she's really kind of trying to lead, I don't want to say an insurrection inside the Oklahoma Republican Party, but it feels that way a little bit. Yes.
She's trying to force it to moderate.
Right.
I don't know if that's possible in this day and age. And I don't know if she has much of an impact within her own party.
Right.
I do think she was marginal. I mean, and we talked about this before we came on air. She had been the House chair of the House Appropriations and Budget Committee when we were dealing with massive shortfalls towards the end of the Mary Fallin administration. And there were a bunch of Republicans saying what we need to do is cut and cut more. And she was on that chairing that committee, and she was like, there's nothing else left to cut. Right. And we're going to have to raise taxes. And eventually she gets removed from that position, right? The leadership yanked her. Yeah. And it's not long after that she announces she's going to run for labor commissioner. And so, she's kind of she is definitely on the outside now. Whereas as chair of the A&B committee, you are on the inside.
Absolutely.
Right?
So I was actually in the press room whenever she came in with the red wave in 2010. And so Leslie Osborne came in as extraordinarily conservative, right? And I remember her little headband. She's made the progression of Leslie Osborne should be a study in terms of her politics, her style. I mean, just all of it is really, really fascinating. She floors me. I'm waiting the announcement, right? It's right, Carmen.
Yeah. I mean, we talked about before this podcast started, whether Leslie Osborne's going to run for governor. And I think what James said before the podcast started is the key question is if she runs, would she run as a Republican or a Democrat?
I think it depends on what Drummond is running as.
Yeah. Well, I assume Drummond would run as a Republican, but
I don't know.
I don't
Maybe.
know. Is he going to take a page out of Joy Hoffmeister's playbook too?
Well,
It's interesting stuff.
So this gets me back to the poor condition of the Democrat Party in Oklahoma. When we're talking about who's going to run for governor as a Democrat, and we're pulling up Republicans.
Yeah, absolutely.
And not any Democratic
There's
names.
no Democratic name.
I don't have anybody.
Joy Hoffmeister and then now we maybe Leslie Osborne, maybe Gentner Drummond. I mean, who knows, right? But the reality is, if you just look at registration, running as a Republican gives you a lot more advantages starting off than running as a Democrat in this state. But if you want to get to the general election, you might consider running as a Democrat, right? Because the competition is going to be much less.
Yeah, moderate Republicans just don't stand a chance in primaries anymore.
In primaries in Oklahoma, they don't. What is fascinating to me, you youngsters may not remember this, but there was a time when this state was dominated by Democrats, much as heavily as it is dominated by Republicans today. And so all the stuff that we're talking about Democrats today, I remember my parents and people that were a little bit older than me talking the same way about Republicans. If I want to vote, I need to register as Democrat because there's no Republicans running for this or that. So it's just amazing how much this has flipped. I anticipate in 20 or 30 years, I don't think the pendulum's ever going to swing back all the way to Democrat dominance like it was, but I think we're going to swing back closer to the middle. And that'll be interesting to watch and see how that's dealt with as well.
I agree.
Yeah.
I agree.
All right. So before we get into stories and ideas.
Are we going to actually talk to Carmen?
Yes. Carmen, I want you to just give us a little bit about your background. How did you get to be this world famous journalist from Oklahoma who we follow closely and who is very active in tracking and reporting on Oklahoma politics? How did you get here?
I don't know about world famous, but I appreciate that. Thank you. So I was born and raised in Norman, went to OU. I worked on my high school student newspaper. And I think that's kind of where I got into journalism a little bit.
Which high school?
At Norman North.
Oh, no. Okay. Wait a minute. Okay. So of course you listeners
Go
know.
Timberwolves.
Right. No, ma'am. You know, the name of our podcast is Not My Generation. So Norman North tells me that you're way younger than I am. Oh, that's painful. So what year?
Class of 2010. So yeah, young.
Okay. So we're West Side OG, right? Class of 2003. So that's a little painful. But it's okay, right? We're still within the millennial-esque.
Well, and it's
Are you technically a millennial?
I'm a millennial, yeah.
Right. But you're not a geriatric one like me. Okay.
No,
Fair
no.
enough. Fair enough.
But it is funny
That is
because
such a horrible label. I
know.
believe
It's the
people are
internet.
using
Don't
that.
blame me. It's the internet. I prefer elder.
I did grow up much closer to physically distance wise to Norman High, but then they shipped us across the town.
It's ridiculous.
Silly.
We love it.
So I think y'all appreciate this. So my mom was a political science professor.
Okay.
And then my dad, he used to be a law professor at OU, but then before that, when they met in DC. He was working on the Hill. And so as I was growing up, we would always have these, it was standard practice. My parents would watch the evening news at 5:30, and then we'd eat dinner and we'd talk about the news. Yep. And so we were always having these political conversations at home as I was growing up. And I think that's kind of where I got my spark of I'm interested in this. And I did speech and debate in high school. And I was maybe I'll go to law school, maybe I'll be a lawyer. Yeah. And then it flipped and now I'm in journalism.
Awesome.
Fabulous.
Awesome.
Yeah. So,
love it.
And after I graduated OU, I worked, I desperately wanted to get out of the state for a bit. That'll do that to you when you go to college in your hometown.
Yes, absolutely.
And so I lived in Virginia for a while, covered politics there, lived in Phoenix for a while, covered politics there, and then eventually moved back.
So you kind of are world famous, just a little bit.
A little bit.
I kind of fell in love with you just a little bit more to learn all about that background. That's fabulous.
And you've worked for some different outlets here in Oklahoma, right? So tell us a little bit about that.
Yes. So I worked for the Oklahoman for almost 4 years, and then briefly worked for for the Tulsa World. Same job at both places, covering the state capitol, the governor, Oklahoma legislature, all that. And now I work for a new publication called Oklahoma Voice, which some of your listeners may not have heard of.
Yes, please tell them. It's fabulous.
So Oklahoma Voice, we're a nonprofit news outlet. We're new. We're relatively small. We only have a staff of 4. But our goal is to basically do daily coverage of state government and state politics. And the best part is it's free. It's free to read, and there's no paywalls. We don't have advertisers. We're a nonprofit, so we do accept contributions. But it's an affiliate of a national group called States Newsroom, which has about 40 newsrooms in capital cities across the state, across the country. And they're all trying to cover, do a better job of keeping an eye on state government, state politics. And I think the idea is kind of born out of, as newspapers have been shrinking over the years, we need more eyes on what our leaders in power are doing. And we can't put all of that coverage behind a paywall, because then only those who have the means to afford it can read about it or stay up on what is happening, up at the state capitol.
Yeah, absolutely. Press corps, Capitol press corps particularly, are a dying thing, and have been over the 21st century. This has been reported over and over and over. And so what you guys are doing is such an awesome thing. Also, it's unique in the fact that it is for ladies running it, correct?
Yeah.
This is so cool.
And we didn't go into it. Like my editor, Janelle, she hired 3 reporters, and she didn't go into it saying, I want to hire all women.
Right.
But it just happened that way.
Which is really cool. And it provides a unique voice, I think, that is necessary, desperately necessary in any industry, but certainly journalism and political media specifically. And so I really wanted to point that out and give a shout out to you guys. I love what you guys do.
Well, thank you.
And one of the things I have appreciated about it is you're fairly balanced in how you present information and how you provide information. I know you allow people to sometimes submit commentaries and such, and those have been all over the place. And so I've really appreciated that aspect of it as well. And might have to submit some commentaries.
I was going to say, he's going to ask for
I might.
He's going to ask for byline.
You are welcome to submit. I think we'd probably run them. So.
But so what is the niche that Oklahoma Voice is trying to fill? What is lacking that you're like, we can step in here and we can fill a gap or a need that's there?
Yeah. So great question, because we do have several other journalism nonprofits here in the state, and they do great work, and we're not trying to push them out or duplicate what they do. But the fact of the matter is that publications like Oklahoma Watch and The Frontier, they tend to do long form investigative work, and their reporters may spend weeks or months working on the same story and not have a lot of daily coverage or in sometimes any daily coverage. And we feel that, you still readers need a daily view of what's happening at the state capitol. And, we try to do it a little bit differently. We try to, focus on the impacts that legislation or policies or proposals have on the general populace. But, we don't want to just gloss over the news that's happening every day and focus on, the big fish, the big investigative stories. And we do some investigative work, but it's more like quick turn, some records requests, but we're not going to spend, months on a giant story.
Yeah.
That I think people don't appreciate how much time it takes to do that kind of investigative reporting.
Yes.
Right?
And we're lucky that we have news outlets that focus on that.
Right. And to me, seeing the emergence over the last decade or so of these various outlets that you mentioned, Oklahoma Watch, Non-Doc with Trey Savage. I've worked with them on a lot of things. So seeing the emergence of these, to me, it is such a positive because it gives us more of an insight into what's going on. We have a little bit better information on which to make decisions. And it's not all kind of monolithic coming out from one voice, from one perspective. You get a variety of different things. that's the thing I think is unique in this environment is there's not this kind of groupthink. We're all covering the same thing and we're all saying the same thing about that story, right?
Yes, I appreciate that because we all try to cover the same news in some regard, but we all cover it in different ways.
Sure.
And, Trace will come about it from a really deep dive sort of angle and non-doc. And I can learn so much from some of his articles.
Right.
But then, Oklahoma Watch may take a totally different tack to it. So I love it.
Yes. No, it's fantastic and it's desperately needed.
Yes, exactly. All necessary.
So let's talk about what are some of the major stories that you feel like you guys have covered up to this point, and what is it that you're looking at, in the near future? Let's talk about it a little bit. Are you okay with that?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right.
Sure. Yeah. So I feel like I don't tend to cover education, but I feel like we've had some really good stories about Ryan Walters and his administration, kind of peeling back the layer a little bit on the number of folks that have left the Oklahoma State Department of Education, some of the difficulties that folks have had in getting basically transparency out of the department. I wrote a story with our education reporter about Stitt's former education secretary who resigned after like 3 months, and everybody was like, why? Where did she go? Well, it turned out she resigned because she couldn't get the Walters administration to give her details on their financials. Right. And she was like, I can't stick around if this is going to be how it is.
So I had a very interesting conversation with a state legislator that if I said their name, we all know, and I'm not going to because they told me this and weren't telling me this to share with everybody, but that there has become tension between Stitt and Walters.
I've heard that.
And part of why the Stitt Secretary of Education left was she did not want to be caught in the middle of that tension. So
I could see that. And I think that could play into why it's taken him so long to name a new education secretary. Yeah, I mean, she resigned this summer and we're about to hit a new year. Yes. So he's got to find the right person who is okay with dealing with Walters and potentially being caught in the middle of this tension between the governor's office and OSDE.
Right. So that's going to be very interesting to see how he navigates that. And because he's got a really narrow, he's going to want someone who's on board with the school choice plan. But I think he's going to want someone who can be a counterbalance somewhat to Walters as well. And I think he wants to be talking about some of the good things that are happening in Oklahoma education, right? And not be constantly accusing teachers of being closet Marxist or open Marxist, not accusing school librarians of being perverts and such like this.
Making the national news for the education secretary is not great.
And that to me, this is one of the interesting stories that recently is this whole, I want to hire someone to boost my media profile, if you will, right?
Which I don't feel like he needs more boosting. Like, I mean, I saw he had an op-ed in Newsweek this week. Yeah. He's constantly on right-wing television shows. I think he's doing pretty good in terms of the media buying,
He's definitely probably runner-up for, at least in the running for Trump's next Secretary of Education, right?
Oh, I would think
so. Right? Right?
Yeah. The thing with Trump is he doesn't care about he's not ideologically driven.
Not at all. Right. He wants to know that you're going to scrap and fight and be out
for
there.
Him, and you're going to be loyal to him.
Walters is that.
And you should not have any expectation that he's going to be loyal back. Right?
Or give you anything in return.
That's exactly right. And so Walters might fit in really well there. And then there might be conflict because, Walters, I get the sense, is a true believer, which scares me a little bit more about him.
I'm going to segue my textbook committee stuff in here. Can I segue?
Yes,
please.
And I will try not to rant today about
No, really,
that,
I love it. Right. So the listeners know that James went on one on the last episode because I was talking about your article on the textbook committee, and that day that we were recording, they were actually meeting. So I was kind of curious, what was the outcome? Do you know of the meeting? And we noted that Moms for Liberty, man, they were fighting those woke math books. So were they successful, Carmen?
Yeah. So Moms for Liberty was somewhat successful. Okay. So they have taken issue with, so every cycle, the textbook committee delves into a different subject area for textbooks. And this year they're doing math textbooks. And so Moms for Liberty has complained about these textbooks from McGraw-Hill, which is a major publisher across the U.S. They don't like their elementary school or pre-K through elementary school math textbooks because they feel that the textbooks contain social emotional learning, which has become like the new CRT basically in conservative circles, where you're not exactly sure what it is, but conservatives are mad about it.
Right.
We need to have somebody on who is somewhat of an expert on that, and they can explain what that is. I know I have another sister who is now an assistant principal in more public schools, and so she was talking about social and emotional learning and did not describe it at all like Moms for Liberty described it. So it would be nice to have someone who can just
define it,
lay that out and say, here's what we're talking about. Here's how it plays out.
Yeah.
Here's how this might wrap into a math
book.
exercise or a civics exercise or
math.
Social studies or whatever. But it would be nice to have a kind of an unvarnished and unbiased perspective on that. Yeah. And so if I'm going to critique the media, and this is not just you, but anyone, on when they cover things like those topics, nobody ever explains to me what this stuff is. Nobody ever says when Ryan Walters goes out and is railing against CRT, and by the way, I think there are some legitimate criticisms of that, and I think there's a lot of, let me just put it this way, I don't think anybody's telling the truth, regardless of what side you're on. Nobody's telling the truth about CRT, whether that's out of ignorance or whether that's out of just wanting to mislead, but nobody is. But you guys, it would be helpful if you would say, here is what CRT is, and go to a source that talks about it. So that would be really helpful. And then the public can say, okay, do I like this? Do I not like this? How is it trying to be being applied to certain things, right? That's my biggest criticism in some of these discussions is nobody's ever defining this stuff. We're just saying Ryan Walters said this, and then somebody in the Democrats and the legislature said that. And I'm like, well, what the heck are they talking about? I know it's CRT, but I have no idea what that is.
Yeah, that's fair. I think part of the problem is these are ill-defined concepts. They're broad, right? And so what Ryan Walters sees as CRT may not necessarily be what like an African-American history professor sees as CRT.
I am going to recommend, I will recommend a source to you. In fact, I'll email you. So there's a sociological handbook that has a specific chapter written by two critical theorists on here's what CRT is. And I think it's very helpful for me into understanding what I think about it. But it's not written by somebody who's criticizing it. And it's not written in an advocacy way. It's written as this is what it is. Yeah. And to me, that was extremely helpful in understanding what is it that we're talking about. And I agree, all of these ideas that originate really with us academics, get distorted and diluted and modified by politicians who
to fit an
hear
agenda.
something. Yeah. And so you are correct in the sense that everybody uses the term, but they don't use it the same way. So giving a baseline and saying where did that come from? How did it emerge? And what are the basic principles or tenets behind it? And then how are these other officials using it? How are they distorting it or modifying it or whatnot? And what's behind that distortion? To me, that is like supremely helpful. But it may not be, quite frankly, it might not be the most entertaining news. But for me, I'm a nerd, and I like to be informed, and that's where I would go.
That's a good suggestion.
And that, listeners, was James Davenport's rant of the day.
I'm sorry, and I'm really not. Listen, I think
it was only a mild one.
I think
it was
you
a
guys
soapbox,
do great
not a rant.
work, and I think there's so much going on that it is impossible to cover everything from every angle.
You know that one of my gemstones is the burden of a democracy is on us, right? So it's also, right, whenever they define these things or whenever they reference these things in the media, they can't be sure exactly what Walters is saying or what he is defining. That's subjective. And so it becomes, the onus is on you as the reader to be a critical thinker and to do exactly what you did. Go and seek out the information from a factual, just plain, the information standpoint. You've got to do the work though, man. You can't, the media cannot do the work for you.
They can't do it all.
You've got to do the work.
But you know what I have found? So what I have found is that, and I'll just give an example, one example of me personally, a reporter from Tulsa, the Tulsa World, I think, wrote a story on, it was really about women in the workforce and in Oklahoma. And I think it was something related to the wage gap or whatnot. In the story, she had a line that said 50% of women in Oklahoma earn the minimum wage. Mm-hmm. I study the minimum wage, and I knew immediately that was not accurate. And I had the resources ready at my disposal. I emailed her. I said, here's the BLS figures for how many people in total earn the minimum wage in Oklahoma, which is why I know what was said the other night was not accurate. How many people in total earn the minimum wage in Oklahoma. And if 50% of women earn the minimum wage, that number would be way higher. Right. And she recognized that. She said, hey, thanks for letting me know. So I have found if you reach out to journalists and you say, hey, I saw this, you might want to look at this, or you might, and you're not the angry, I can't believe you're so biased and I can't believe you know. And I've had some back and forth with a journalist before where I felt like, the way they characterized something wasn't fair. And I'm fully listen, everybody's going to defend their work, and I have no grudge against someone who's going to defend their work. But I have found Oklahoma journalists, by and large, if you approach them as, hey, I want to help you understand this issue better, here's some information you ought to look at, are extremely welcoming of
accessible,
that.
right?
Right. They don't just go, oh, you don't know what you're talking about.
They don't want to put out misinformation. Right. That is not what they're there for. And that's a really critical thing for people to understand. And I think I take a lot of this personally, personal umbrage, because I was in the Capitol Press Corps for a while. And so this is, it's something that I rail about in my classes because of the, fake news, alternative facts, right? The media is not there to pat your government on the back or these politicians. They are there to give you news and information in a factual, nonpartisan way for you, critically thinking, cognitive human being, to put in your own political, moral, religious, whatever context, and then make actionable decisions based on that, period, right? If your news is telling you how to vote, what to think, etc., you need to seek a different source unless you're reading an op-ed, right? That's Dr. Stacy's soapbox for the day.
Right. Well, and journalists, we are human. We're flawed. Yes. We're going to get things wrong sometimes. That happens, but all you can do is be transparent about it and just do better the next time.
Exactly.
And I think my interaction with the vast majority of Oklahoma journalists has been exactly that.
Yes, absolutely.
They're like, what, do you have something to offer? What can we do better on? And most of them do really good work.
Absolutely.
Really good work.
We've got lots of homies in the Oklahoma media. We just had Wendy Suarez from broadcast media to, the print. And we've been, really blessed to have those connections and to know these people who, are in our eyes rock stars. I mean, you guys are rock stars, to have those kind of connections and to know you guys is really very cool.
Well, thank you.
I don't know.
I like knowing you guys. I think you guys are rock stars. So
we try.
Well, Emily is. Yeah. I am the old grumpy man in the room. That's my role.
We still love you.
So what other stories are you guys following, or do you feel like this was a particularly really good one that we really did a good job of informing people about this topic? Give us some of that.
Yeah, I mean, I would say education's obviously going to be a hot topic. Yeah. I think we've done a good job of covering education. Indigenous affairs is blowing up.
Yeah.
I think sometimes we feel lacking as a staff because none of us are Indigenous, and it can be hard to cover the Indigenous communities, I should say, not community singular, but when you're not one of them, but I think we try to do a good job. So education and then just general government stuff. I mean, like whatever the heck the legislature is up to now, which I mean, I think next year is going to be tax cuts, maybe compacts. Well, I don't know.
Okay. I'm just going to, we've discussed this on the program before. They could have had tax cuts in their special session if the governor would have just
talk to Greg Treat.
Yeah, from let's get rid of the income tax to really what I want is a 0.25% cut. That's a huge.
What were you guys doing? What were your thoughts? Were you there? What was happening?
I mean, I just figured like, oh, this is just like a waste of time, right? Like, I mean, because of exactly if they had all gotten in a room, McCall, Greg Treat, and the governor, if they'd all gotten in a room, weeks before the special session, they probably could have hashed out some sort of deal and boom, had a 0.25 point tax cut. But, for weeks leading up to the special session, the governor was not super clear on what he wanted. And then in the press conference the morning of special session, he says, well, I'll take a 0.25 point cut. That's what I want. You could do that and nothing else and then leave, even though he had 2 other things in his special session, Paul.
There was something about transparency and all of that. And it was like, don't worry about any of that. Just give me that quarter.
Yes. It's like, well, why didn't you just write that in your special session?
It also seemed like he continues to snub Greg Treat, right? It is very clear. And McCall was in that press conference, right? Next to him. And Treat was not. I mean, it's very clear the love lost there is.
Yeah, I don't think that they have the best relationship anymore. I mean, that would just be me speculating.
Sure, right, of course. Oh, that's all we do here.
And I do think that they all talk. I think Speaker McCall and Greg Treat. Yeah, but I don't know that they're friendly.
Well, it's rough. My perception is that Treat, as the president pro tem of the Senate, does not like the governor or anybody else saying, I expect you to do this. Now go and do it. Right.
And Governor Stitt definitely has this mentality sometimes that the legislature works for him.
The businessman.
And that's not how it works
at all.
I think it's the biggest detriment to someone coming into politics who has no political experience, and they're coming from that CEO background where they're used to just giving orders and those orders being followed, to now I have to work with this group of 101 in the House and 48 in the Senate. And most of the 48 in the Senate think they could all do that job better than him anyway. And a lot of the folks in the House do as well. And they all have their own agendas and they all have their own constituencies. And a governor who doesn't recognize that you've got to navigate that.
For a president. It's a direct parallel to the Trump administration. It's a direct parallel.
You have to build working coalitions to advance your agenda. And it does seem like Stitt has never quite learned that lesson.
And it's such a great, I love pointing to this for our students, right? Because whenever you get a supermajority like that, you expect for the Greece to, all of it, they're going to pass everything through. They're all one color, one flavor of one party, etc. It's much worse. It is sometimes so much worse, right? 2010, oh my God, you got Mike Reynolds and the Liberty Caucus, and you break off from the moderate Republicans, and the Oklahoma State Capitol has not been the same since.
The factions that emerge out of that supermajority and the trouble they can cause anybody who's wanting to do anything. And to me, a successful governor is going to be someone who can work with each group when they need to advance something, but doesn't get too close, right? I think some of that is if I get too close with these folks, then they're going to expect me to do certain things, or I'm going to expect them to do certain things. But yeah, I very much view Treat as we are the Senate. We have an agenda. If you want us to be part of your agenda, you need to come to us and you need to work with us. And I just haven't seen the governor respond to that in a positive way.
There was a little bit of pontification last night at the event about the good old days of the Capitol when we had a split majority, the Senate was split, and you had co-chairs, and it was incredible, right, between the two parties. And I remember being in the press room multiple times, one session where the Democrats would group together with the Republicans, or some Republicans would break off and they'd walk out, just deuce out of the chamber and not vote. It was those were the good old days, man. You don't get that kind of stuff anymore.
You're forced to learn how to work across the aisle, right? In that kind of environment.
Not anymore. Not in Oklahoma, anyways.
You're not. Now, what is interesting is there is some alliance, not based on unified perspective, but similar goals, in that sometimes you see some of those really, really conservative Republicans voting with Democrats because they both oppose what the majority's trying to do, what the leadership's trying to do. They oppose for different reasons.
Yes, like abortion type stuff. You know, the far right folks in the legislature will vote against it because it doesn't go far enough. And then Democrats will go vote against some of these anti-abortion measures because they go too far in their opinion.
Exactly. Exactly. So it is a fascinating environment to watch. And I think people who don't understand how legislative bodies work sometimes don't understand why these outcomes occur, which is why you're so important, because you can help explain some of that to people, right?
I don't know. I have days where I'm like, I don't know what's going on up here.
We have all had those days of what the heck is going on, right?
Absolutely.
So yeah, I think next year will be very interesting. I mean, it'll be Greg Treat's last year leading the Senate, McCall's last year leading the House, and
change elections.
And then,
So the House is going to lose at least two of its top three leadership. So McCall turns out, John Eccles turns out. I'm not sure if anybody else in that kind of leadership group does. As you mentioned, Treat does. And who's going to fill in those slots? And,
I think we're going to see some infighting amongst the caucuses.
Well, you kind of had this kind of insurgency of Rob Standrich, who was going to challenge Treat for the pro tem slot this year, and that didn't pan out for him. But Treat's not going to be there again, and so that's going to be really interesting to see who is able to garner enough votes to take that position.
And could be interesting to see if Governor Stitt gets involved in leadership elections, to see if he tries to guide the bodies to elect somebody he might work better with.
Right. I would be, if I'm governor, I'm going to be hesitant to do that.
I wouldn't.
But
I'm not governor, so thank goodness. What else is going on in the state? So we've got all of these different state agencies. We have the Corporation Commission that has actually been strangely out of the news a whole lot.
It really
lately.
has.
There was a period of 2 or 3 years that felt like they were in the news constantly.
Especially with rates
like
going up.
Things have quieted down a little bit. I know there's the deal over Drummond, is that right? Do I remember this right? Drummond has filed a lawsuit, or is looking at filing a lawsuit against some of the energy companies for the whole winter crisis.
Yes, a couple years ago, that may have overcharged.
Right.
But he's still looking at filing the lawsuit. That's why he subpoenaed the Corporation Commission recently. Yeah. But I think that was kind of the last big news out of there. Yeah. I mean, I think part of the problem is the Corporation Commission is such a complicated beast, and there are very few people who know how to cover it correctly. Like a rate increase, TV reporters, everybody can cover that. But you get into some of this nitty gritty stuff that the CorpCom does, and it's like, what?
Sean Ashley used to be the everything, the brain trust for CorpCom. Ugh. It's awful.
Another organization that has been somewhat out of the news lately, this is probably a good thing, is DHS, right?
DHS has really quieted down,
There's not been a lot going on there. I remember, again, this was right as Stitt had come in, was first elected or something, where there's the whole issue of they'd claimed to have lost $30 million or something, or needed $30 million. And then all
that
of a
was
sudden,
the health department.
Well, okay, yeah,
Yes.
right, yeah.
Because they had that slush, I'm doing air quotes, slush fund of like, and that was a whole mess.
Yeah.
But yeah, the health department's kind of quieted down too. I mean, it's kind of funny.
I'm wondering, is it the fact that things have quieted down in those areas, or is it just
Walter's
the fact
so loud.
that what's happening in the State Department of Education is just consuming all the oxygen in the room, right? And it is so loud and it is so in your face, and it forces you guys to cover it because of the way that all of that's being handled, that the attention that might be devoted to these other areas just is not there.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's both. I think the news ebbs and flows at various state agencies. Right. You'll have some agencies that become really contentious or dramatic, and that'll be a thing for 6 months and die out. But, Brian Walters is sucking a lot of the oxygen out of the room. And I really wish, as a journalism community, that the Oklahoma media could have like a broader discussion on it's like I see a lot of reporters doing everything that went wrong with covering Trump. It's like, oh, okay, the dude tweets something and you write a story about it every time he tweets something crazy. And then he realizes he gets free media attention and is on the news every night because he tweets crazy things. And so maybe we should reevaluate how we cover this person. And
I think that's a very valid criticism. I thought one of the reasons why the criticisms of Trump were not as effective as they might be is there were just so many, and there was no perception of proportionality, right? Everything he did wrong was the worst thing in the world, and it all just became noise at some point. And I think we run the risk of doing that in this situation as well, as it all just becomes background noise and such. And so I don't know, but I think that is. So I have a couple of questions for you. Shoot. All right. Do I have 10 minutes?
We've been, this is, I know.
Good conversation.
I know. We're going to wrap
this has been wonderful.
Really, but usually I'm the one on top of the time, but now, so.
I know. We're having a good time, clearly.
Yes. All right. So what's the one thing you wish the general public knew about the work journalists do that they don't? What's the one misperception or the misunderstanding about your job that you wish the public knew more about?
I hate this criticism that we're we're somehow an enemy, right? What Trump has branded us as an enemy of the people. But really, if anything, we're there to shed light on government, how it works, how it's spending your tax dollars for the public. We are, if anything, we are a fighter for the public. We are the people you didn't elect to go up to the Capitol and spend way too many hours up there digesting for you what your lawmakers did and serving it to you in a condensed, readable format or 30-second TV broadcast or something. Yeah. So I know that there is this animosity toward the press. I wish they weren't there. I wish there were more lawmakers, more elected officials that, would not lean into that, into vilifying us, because, we're just up there doing our job, and our job is to promote a good and healthy democracy.
Yes.
I don't have time for this. So let me just go ask. There's another whole role I could have went with just that last comment.
We'll have her back. We're already planning. We're planning.
Absolutely. Last question. I asked this of our media panel at OPSA, and I'm really interested is what has been the biggest challenge, do you think, to doing your job that has emerged over the last decade or so? And then what has also been the biggest positive change in the way journalism is conducted that you think?
Positive change. We have to think on that one. Okay. But the hardest thing is, going back to sort of this idea that the press is somehow vilified as the villain in all of this. It is I feel like it is harder as the years go on to get people on the phone or to get certain elected officials to talk to you because, they might be ultra conservative or far right. And they may just think, oh, you're the media, I don't want to talk to you. And that's fine. You don't want to talk to us. I can still do my job, whether you talk to me or not. But I think there's this lack of mutual understanding. Like if you can't see me as a person and we can't have a conversation in a hallway about, even if it's just pleasantries, how's your family? How are my dogs? Like we lose sight of each other and why we're there and why we're doing it. Positives about journalism. I will say, I do think that during COVID that the Oklahoma journalist group, journalists in Oklahoma really rallied around each other. One, because, we were all working during COVID. It was kind of miserable. We're all stuck working from home and we're working more and harder than we were in the past. It created mental health issues, I think, but I just felt like, reporters were standing up for each other, backing each other's work. And I think that that's been really nice to see, especially, when we have all these different publications that, tackle the news differently, that we're all, at our heart working together.
It's fantastic.
Very good. Well, Carmen Forman from Oklahoma's Voice, thank you for joining us today. This has been a fantastic conversation.
We will have you back very soon.
Absolutely.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's been our pleasure. Thanks to everybody who's listening. And just remember, democracy is not a spectator sport.
It is not.
All right. So we'll see you next time.
We love communication that goes both ways, not just you listening to us pontificate. We would love to hear from our audience. If you have comments, suggestions, or would like to contact us about possibly being a guest on the show, please email notmygeneration@raider.rose.edu.